Let us see one more example to print the permutation of the word ABC. Permutation is a possible ordering of a sequence. So let us see how it works. So here I have written a code with three deep nested for loops, that is first for loop and second for loop. Inside the second for loop we have one test condition. Only if the test condition satisfies, then it will move to the third for loop. Inside the third for loop again we have one more test condition with the two variables along with the compound boolean expression and operator. Only if the condition becomes true, then the print statement will print the sequence of the letter, okay, ordered sequence. Let us run this code first and see what is the output, and then I will show you how to analyze this code. So here we got the six combination of the sequences, six combination of the order of the word ABC, six sequences, or 6 times we can order the word ABC in this way: ABC, ACB, BAC, BCA, CAB and CBA, and no word should repeat. Let us analyze this code here. So here there are total 3 for loops, okay. First one is this one, and second one is this one, and third one is this one. Here the total number of loops is equal to the number of times the loop evaluates for each loop multiplied by the 3 loops, or third innermost loop multiplied by the second innermost loop and the first outermost loop. Each loop will repeat for 3 times because we have 3 words in a string ABC. Look at here, ABC. The first for loop has to repeat for 3 times, the second for loop has to repeat for 3 times, and similarly the third for loop has to repeat for 3 times. But how it repeats, that is very important. So look at here, when we select the first element in the string, means first element in the first for loop, it will move to the second for loop. There is no condition inside the first for loop. In the second for loop there is one condition. Only if the condition becomes true, then it will move to the third for loop. So this if statement is the body of the second for loop. Second for loop has to repeat for 3 times because the word is ABC, okay, for the same word. But it has to do the useful work only if the condition becomes true. If the condition becomes true in the if statement, which is inside the second for loop, then third for loop will be evaluated. The third for loop will repeat for 3 times because of the word ABC. Inside the third for loop we have a condition. Why this condition? Because no 2 words should repeat, okay. So finally we are printing the ordered sequence, or the permutation of the different letters in the word, okay. So let us see how it works. Once the control flow enters the innermost loop, that is here the third loop, the control flow will repeat for 3 times, because the innermost loop is nothing but the third loop, has to repeat itself for 3 times. Okay, once it repeats 3 times for each element in the second for loop. Look at here, for each element in the second for loop. Once the second for loop activates, it has to repeat 3 times, or the second for loop has to repeat 3 times for each element in the first for loop, because first for loop control flow will check for 3 times. Okay, because the number of elements present in the string are 3. Okay, so therefore the innermost third loop has to repeat itself for each element in the second for loop, and the second for loop has to repeat itself for each element in the first for loop. So this is how the looping operation takes place inside the nested loops or in nested loop. Okay, so now let us start analyzing the code. First, for this first word ABC, so once the control flow moves inside the innermost loop, it goes from innermost loop to outermost loop. Once it enters into the innermost loop from the outermost loop. Okay, this is the first word or first sentence you must remember. Now let us move from first loop to third loop with the condition in the second loop, because the condition in the third loop is nothing but the useful work. Okay, it will just print the permutation of the word with the different ordering of the letters. So let us move from the first loop to third loop with the condition in second for loop. Okay, now the first element varies from, first is nothing but the variable name. It is just an variable name. It doesn't mean that first means the for loop will select the first element, and second means the for loop will select the second element. No, these are the variable names just to indicate the first for loop, second for loop and third for loop. Okay, we are using these names just to indicate the first for loop, second for loop and the third for loop. Okay, first means variable, varies from A to C. The second variable, so observe the word variable. Okay, second is the variable name. Second variable varies from A to C, and the third variable name third also varies from A to C. So now first element in the first for loop varies from A to C. Assume that the first for loop has started its looping by selecting the first element, that is A. Okay, so first for loop, we are moving from first for loop, so we are at the element A. Okay, the first element A has been selected in the first for loop. So now there is no any other statements in the body of the first for loop. So body of the first for loop is nothing but the second for loop, so we are moving to the second for loop. Inside the second for loop, again the second variable varies from A to C, so we have selected the variable A, and there is a condition. Okay, Look at here, condition. Second variable should not be equal to the first variable selected in the first for loop. The second element selected in the second for loop should not be equal to the first variable selected in the first for loop, which is the second element selected in the second for loop. Okay, the element selected in the second for loop at this moment is nothing but a, and the element selected in the first for loop at this moment is nothing but first a. Yes, so a is not equal to a, condition becomes false. Once the condition becomes false, once the if condition becomes false, the body of the if condition will not be evaluated. So are you observing? Okay, next, still we are in the second for loop, because once the if condition becomes false, body of the if condition will not be evaluated. As I told you earlier, the control flow operation goes from innermost loop to outermost loop once it enters into the innermost loop from the outermost loop. And here the second for loop repeats 3 times, okay, for each element selected in the first for loop. So once the condition becomes false, the if statement body will not be evaluated, but still we left with 2 elements in the second for loop, it is b and c. Okay, b and c. Still we are in the second for loop because the control flow moves from innermost loop to outermost loop. So we have not yet entered into the third loop. Okay, please remember. Now we are at the second for loop, and this time the variable second becomes b, because the second element inside the word is nothing but b, right? Okay, so second for loop, the item in the sequence is nothing but b. This is the sequence, string sequence. Item in the second for loop is nothing but b, and the condition, what is the condition? Second is not equal to first. The second element means the second item in the second for loop is nothing but b now, and the first element selected in the first for loop is nothing but a. So b is not equal to a, the condition becomes true, and the body of the if statement will be evaluated, and the third for loop activate the loop itself. Once this condition becomes true, third for loop will be evaluated, because this is the body of this if statement. Third for loop is the body of the if statement, which is inside the second for loop. Okay, so now we are at the third loop. Okay, now third loop, the first element selected is a. This is just a variable third. The third variable will take the value a. Now the element third becomes a, and the condition a should not be equal to first. What is the selected element in the first for loop? That is a. A is not equal to a, and third is not equal to second. The selected element in the third for loop is nothing but a. A is not equal to second. What is the second element selected in the, means the element selected in the second for loop is nothing but b, right? So b, look at here, a is not equal to a and a is not equal to b. This condition becomes false and this condition becomes true, but due to compound Boolean expression, the total expression becomes false. This condition, whole condition becomes false, and body of the if statement will not be evaluated. Since we are in the innermost third loop, yes, right, we are in the innermost third loop, This loop repeats itself first. Okay, here there is an if condition inside the third for loop, but the third for loop has to repeat 3 times because of the literal string ABC. Okay, we have left with 2 elements B and C. So now we are at the third loop with the selected element as B. Now the third variable got the item in the sequence B. Okay, the third element will be assigned, or the third element becomes B in the sequence ABC. Okay, because this is the second element in the sequence. Now the third for loop, the element selected is B, and again check for the condition. Third, the element is B. First, the element selected in the first for loop is nothing but A. Okay, and the third with the second. Third is nothing but B, and the second element selected in the second for loop is nothing but B. B is not equal to B. So the whole compound expression becomes false, because this expression becomes true whereas this expression becomes false. So the total condition becomes false. So the print statement will not be evaluated. Again, third loop has to repeat for one more element, that is C. Okay, C. Now the third element becomes C, and once again the condition C is not equal to A, because A is the first element selected in the first for loop, and C is not equal to B. Third is not equal to second, because the second element selected in the second for loop is nothing but B. So C is not equal to A and C is not equal to B. So the condition becomes true. It prints ABC as per the statement, print statement, first, second and third. First element selected in the first for loop, that is A, and second, the element selected in the second for loop is nothing but B, and the element selected in the third for loop is nothing but C. So ABC. So these are the evaluation steps to get the word ABC. So here the third for loop completed its looping for the second element B in the second for loop. Okay, just for B. Again the control flow check for last element in the second loop. Okay, since the second for loop has to repeat one more time for the element C in the sequence ABC. Okay, so again once again we are at the second for loop with the element selected as C. Okay, second for loop C, element selected is C, and once again there is a condition, second should not be equal to first. So C, second, the element selected in the second for loop is nothing but C, and first is nothing but what, the element selected in the first for loop, that is A. C is not equal to A, the condition becomes true. Okay, then it will move to the third for loop. Body of the if statement will be evaluated, and the third for loop will activate to loop itself again. Okay, so now third for loop, the element selected is A, and condition A should not be equal to first. This is the element selected in the first for loop, that is A. Once again A is not equal to A, and A should not be equal to second. What is the element selected in the second for loop? That is C. Look at here, that's why I have written the steps. Okay, A is not equal to C, the condition becomes false, the print statement will not print anything. Next, third loop should has to repeat for 2 more times. Now the third loop will repeat for the element B in the sequence ABC. Okay, third for loop B, and the condition third now is nothing but B. B is not equal to A, and B is not equal to second, means B is not equal to C. Look at the condition. B is not equal to A is true, and B is not equal to C, this is true. So the print statement will print first, second and third. First element selected, the element selected in the first for loop is nothing but A, and the element selected in the second for loop is nothing but C. So look at here, the element selected in the second for loop is nothing but C, and third, the element selected in the third for loop is nothing but B. Look at here, for this B only the condition becomes true. Okay, next, the third for loop has to repeat for one more element, that is C. So we are at the third for loop still with the last element C. So third for loop with the item selected as C, and once again check the condition for this if statement. Third is not equal to first, that is selected item is C. C is not equal to A because the element selected in the first for loop is nothing but A, still it is A. Okay, so C is not equal to A, and third is not equal to second. Third, the element selected in the third for loop is nothing but C, and it should not be equal to element selected in the second for loop. So the element selected in the second for loop is nothing but C, right? Look at here. So C is not equal to A, this condition becomes true, whereas C is not equal to C, this condition becomes false, and this print statement will not print anything, means this print statement will not be evaluated. So for the whole elements in the second for loop A, B, C, we got only two ordering of a sequence A, B, C and A, C, B. Similarly, we need to analyze the code for remaining two elements in the first for loop. So still we left with the two elements in the first for loop. We have just analyzed the steps only for the first element A, which is selected in the first for loop. We need to analyze for the element B, and we need to analyze for the element C. So once the element selected in the first for loop becomes B, and if you follow these steps to analyze the control flow, you will get the word BAC and BCA. And once the element selected in the first for loop becomes C, again analyze these steps, you will get the word CAB and CBA. This is how we can analyze this code which prints the permutation of the letters in the word. Still, if you have any doubts, ask me in the question and answer section. I will try to resolve your doubt with the flow diagram. Okay, so I will try to resolve with the flow diagram, not with the steps explained here. steps like here. Okay, I'll try to resolve with the flow diagram, the complete flow diagram. Okay, don't worry. So thanks for watching this. Let us move to the next lesson.